Sometimes the most extraordinary stories begin with the most ordinary moments. A morning jog, a winding trail through Montana wilderness, the sound of boots on gravel, and birds singing in the distance. But what happened on that trail would change two lives forever, proving that miracles don't always come in the form we expect. This is the true story of how a chance encounter between a struggling college student and a mysterious rancher became a testament to the power of human kindness. It's about second chances, unexpected guardians, and the life-changing moment when a stranger's compassion rewrites your entire future. What you're about to read isn't just another feel-good story. It's a reminder that sometimes, when life strips everything away and leaves you completely alone, that's exactly when the universe sends help from the most unlikely places. Sarah Martinez had always believed that if you worked hard enough, things would eventually fall into place. At 22, she had already survived more challenges than most people face in a lifetime. Growing up in foster care, bouncing between homes, she had learned to be self-reliant from an early age. Education had been her lifeline, her ticket to something better. But now, standing in her tiny apartment in Missoula, Montana, staring at the eviction notice taped to her door, she wondered if all her efforts had been in vain. The notice gave her 3 days. 3 days to come up with $800 she didn't have. 3 days before she would lose the only stable home she had known since aging out of the foster system 4 years ago. Sarah crumpled the yellow paper in her fist, fighting back tears that she had trained herself not to shed. Crying wouldn't pay the rent. Crying wouldn't help her finish her senior year at the University of Montana. Crying certainly wouldn't solve the mountain of problems that seemed to grow higher each day. She had been working 2 jobs while maintaining a full course load in social work. The campus bookstore paid minimum wage for 20 hours a week, and she cleaned offices downtown 3 nights a week for cash. It should have been enough. It would have been enough if her car hadn't broken down last month, if she hadn't needed emergency dental work, if the price of textbooks hadn't increased by 30%, if. Life seemed to be nothing but a series of ifs that never worked in her favor. Sarah walked into her small kitchen and opened the refrigerator. A half-empty carton of milk, some wilted lettuce, and a package of ramen noodles stared back at her. She had been eating ramen for 2 weeks straight, saving every penny she could, but it wasn't enough. Nothing was ever enough. She pulled out her phone and scrolled through her contacts, looking for someone who might be able to lend her money. The list was painfully short. Most of her friends were students too, struggling just as much as she was. The few people who might have been able to help were already stretched thin from previous loans that she was still paying back in tiny installments. Her phone buzzed with a text from her academic advisor, Dr. Morrison. The message was brief but devastating. Due to budget cuts, the work-study program was being eliminated immediately. The campus bookstore job that provided her with just enough to buy groceries was gone. Sarah stared at the message until the words blurred together. She read it 3 times, hoping she had misunderstood, but the meaning remained clear. Her already precarious financial situation had just become impossible. The walls of her apartment suddenly felt like they were closing in. She needed air. She needed space to think. Without really planning it, she grabbed her running shoes and headed for the door. Running had always been her escape when things got overwhelming. It didn't cost anything, and it cleared her head better than any counseling session ever could. She had discovered the sport in high school when a coach noticed her natural speed and endurance. Running had earned her a partial scholarship to college, though it wasn't enough to cover everything. Sarah drove her patched-up Honda Civic to Rattlesnake Trail, a popular running spot about 15 minutes from campus. The late afternoon sun was beginning to cast long shadows through the pine trees, and the air carried the crisp bite of early autumn. She parked in the small gravel lot and began stretching, trying to push away the anxiety that had been building all day. Other runners and hikers moved past her, some with dogs, others in pairs, all seeming to belong to a world where people had stable lives and reliable incomes. She started running at an easy pace, letting her muscles warm up gradually. The rhythmic sound of her footsteps on the dirt trail was meditative, and for the first time all day, she felt like she could breathe normally. The trail wound through dense forest, past small streams, and rocky outcroppings. This was one of the few places where Sarah felt truly at peace. Nature didn't judge. Nature didn't send eviction notices or eliminate jobs. Nature just existed, constant and reliable in a way that nothing else in her life seemed to be. As she ran deeper into the forest, Sarah began to process her options. She could try to find another job immediately, but that would mean dropping out of school just months before graduation. She could ask her former foster parents for help, but most of them had made it clear that once she turned 18, she was on her own. She could apply for emergency financial aid, but the bureaucracy took weeks, and she had 3 days. She could live in her car, but where would she park it? How would she shower? How would she maintain the appearance of stability that her internship required? The trail began to climb upward, winding through a section of forest that was less traveled. Sarah pushed herself harder, welcoming the burn in her lungs and legs. Physical pain was easier to deal with than emotional pain. It had clear solutions: rest, hydration, proper nutrition. Unlike her life, which seemed to be spiraling into an unsolvable puzzle. She had worked so hard to get where she was, maintaining a 3.8 GPA while working multiple jobs, completing her field placements at the local community center, building relationships with professors who had become mentors. All of it was about to disappear because she couldn't come up with $800. The sun was beginning to set as Sarah reached a small clearing about 3 miles up the trail. She paused to catch her breath and take in the view. The valley spread out below her, with the lights of Missoula beginning to twinkle in the distance. It was beautiful in a way that made her chest ache. This was supposed to be her home. Montana was supposed to be where she built her life, where she became the social worker she had dreamed of being since she was 15 and had a caseworker who actually cared about what happened to her. Sarah sat down on a fallen log and pulled out her phone to check the time. It was getting late, and she needed to head back before dark. But as she stood up to leave, she heard something that made her freeze. Footsteps, heavy boots on the trail behind her. She turned around, expecting to see another hiker or runner, but the trail behind her was empty. The footsteps continued, getting closer, but she couldn't see anyone. Fear crept up her spine. She was alone on a trail in the middle of the wilderness, with darkness approaching and someone or something moving through the trees. Sarah had always been careful about running alone, but she had been so distracted by her problems that she hadn't thought about basic safety. She started walking quickly back down the trail, but the footsteps behind her seemed to be keeping pace. Every few seconds, she would glance over her shoulder, but the combination of fading light and dense trees made it impossible to see anything clearly. Her walking turned into a jog, then a run. The footsteps behind her seemed to speed up as well. Sarah's heart was pounding, not from exertion, but from pure adrenaline. She knew she was being followed, but she didn't know by whom or why. The rational part of her brain tried to calm her down. It was probably just another runner who happened to be going the same direction. But her instincts, honed by years of having to watch out for herself, were screaming danger. The trail seemed longer on the way back than it had on the way up. Every turn felt like it might reveal her pursuer, but it never did. The footsteps continued, sometimes closer, sometimes farther away, but always there. Sarah began to panic as she realized how isolated she was. It would be completely dark within an hour, and she was still at least 2 miles from the parking area. If someone meant to hurt her, this would be the perfect place to do it. She pulled out her phone to call for help, but the screen showed no signal. She was completely on her own. Sarah pushed herself to run faster than she ever had before, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Branches caught at her clothes and hair as she bounded down the trail, no longer caring about pace or form. All that mattered was getting back to her car, back to civilization, back to safety. Just as panic threatened to overwhelm her completely, Sarah heard something that made her blood run cold. The footsteps had stopped. The forest was completely silent except for her own labored breathing and the sound of her feet hitting the dirt. She slowed to a walk, then stopped completely, listening intently. Nothing. No wind in the trees, no bird calls, no rustling of small animals. Just an unnatural, oppressive silence that made every nerve in her body stand on edge. She stood still for what felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes, waiting to see if the footsteps would resume. When they didn't, she began walking again, slowly and quietly, stopping frequently to listen. The silence continued, but somehow that felt even more threatening than the footsteps had been. At least when she could hear her pursuer, she knew where they were. Now, they could be anywhere. As Sarah rounded the next bend in the trail, she saw something that made her heart leap with relief. Light. Not the harsh beam of a flashlight, but the warm glow of what looked like a small campfire in a clearing just off the trail. Where there was a fire, there were people. People who might be able to help her get safely back to the parking area. She moved toward the light, pushing through the underbrush that separated the trail from the clearing. But as she got closer, Sarah realized that something was wrong. The fire was burning in a ring of stones, clearly man-made, but there was no one around it. No camping gear, no people, no explanation for why someone would build a fire and then leave it unattended. She stood at the edge of the clearing, torn between relief at finding light and confusion about why it was there. The fire was recent, still crackling cheerfully, sending sparks up into the darkening sky. Sarah called out hesitantly, "Hello? Is anyone there?" Her voice echoed strangely in the clearing, seeming to bounce off the trees and come back to her distorted. No one answered. She called again, louder this time, but the result was the same. Whoever had built the fire was gone, leaving behind only the dancing flames and more questions than answers. The smart thing to do would be to keep moving toward the parking area. But the fire was warm and bright, and Sarah was cold, scared, and exhausted. She found herself moving closer to the flames, drawn by their heat and the illusion of safety they provided. As she settled down on a rock near the fire, she noticed something that made her stomach clench with fresh fear. On the ground next to the fire ring, partially hidden by leaves, was a cell phone. Sarah picked it up with trembling hands. The screen was cracked, but it still showed the time and battery level. 70% charge, but no signal, just like her own phone. She turned the device over in her hands, looking for any identifying marks, any clue about who it belonged to and why it had been left behind. That's when she noticed the blood. Just a few dark spots on the phone's case, but unmistakably blood. Sarah dropped the device as if it had burned her, her heart racing again. Someone had been hurt here. Someone had left their phone behind, along with traces of blood and a fire that was still burning. She looked around the clearing with new eyes, searching for other signs of what had happened. There, near the tree line, she spotted them. Dark stains on the fallen leaves that could have been mud, but probably weren't. A piece of fabric caught on a low branch, torn and dirty, signs of a struggle, or worse. Sarah realized that she had stumbled into something dangerous, something that went far beyond a simple case of being followed on a hiking trail. She stood up quickly, backing away from the fire and toward the trail. Whatever had happened in this clearing, she didn't want to be here when whoever was responsible came back. But as she turned to leave, she heard them again. The footsteps. This time, they were coming from multiple directions surrounding the clearing. Sarah was trapped, with nowhere to run and no way to call for help. The footsteps grew closer, and Sarah could hear voices now, low and urgent, though she couldn't make out the words. She crouched behind a large tree, trying to make herself as small and invisible as possible. Her phone buzzed with a text message, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet forest. She quickly silenced it, but it was too late. The voices had stopped, and she could sense that her presence had been detected. A beam of light cut through the darkness, sweeping back and forth across the clearing. Then, another, and another. Sarah realized with growing horror that whoever was out there had flashlights and was searching for her systematically. She was no longer just a woman alone on a trail. She was a witness to something that someone very much wanted to keep secret. The beam of one flashlight passed close to her hiding spot, close enough that she could see the heavy boots of the person carrying it. Military-style boots, not the kind of footwear you would expect from a casual hiker or camper. Sarah pressed herself harder against the tree, hardly daring to breathe. Her problems with rent money and lost jobs suddenly seemed very small compared to the possibility that she might not make it out of these woods alive. As the searchers moved past her position, Sarah began to plan her escape. She would have to move quickly and quietly, using the darkness to her advantage. If she could make it back to the main trail without being seen, she might be able to outrun them to the parking area. Her car keys were in her pocket, and her Honda might be old and unreliable, but it could still get her away from whatever was happening in these woods. But as Sarah prepared to make her move, she heard something that froze her blood. One of the voices, clearer now that its owner was closer, said her name. Not just her first name, but her full name. Sarah Martinez. Someone out there knew who she was, and they were looking for her specifically. This wasn't a case of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. This was planned, targeted, personal. Sarah's mind raced, trying to understand how strangers in the woods could know her name. Had they followed her from her apartment? Was this connected to the eviction notice, to her financial problems? Nothing made sense, but the terrifying reality was that she was alone, trapped, and being hunted by people who knew exactly who she was. The sound of her phone buzzing with another message seemed to echo through the forest like a gunshot. This time, Sarah couldn't silence it quickly enough. The footsteps immediately changed direction, heading straight for her hiding spot. She could see the beams of multiple flashlights converging on her position, and she knew that her time was up. Sarah broke from cover and ran, crashing through the underbrush with no regard for stealth or direction. Behind her, she could hear shouts and the sound of pursuit. The flashlight beams danced wildly through the trees as her pursuers gave chase. She had no idea which direction would lead her back to safety, but staying still meant certain capture, so she ran blindly through the dark forest. Branches tore at her clothes and face as she pushed through dense undergrowth. Her lungs burned from the effort, and her legs felt like lead, but adrenaline kept her moving. The shouts behind her were getting closer, and she could hear the sound of radio chatter. Whoever was after her was organized, professional, and very serious about catching her. Just when Sarah thought her legs would give out, she burst through a line of trees and found herself on a dirt road. She had never seen this road before and had no idea where it led, but it was better than the pathless wilderness she had been running through. She turned left, hoping she was heading towards civilization, and forced her exhausted body to keep moving. The road wound downhill through the forest, and as Sarah rounded a curve, she saw something that made her heart leap with hope. Light. Not the harsh beam of a flashlight, but the warm glow of windows in a building up ahead. As she got closer, she could see that it was a cabin, rustic but well-maintained, with a truck parked out front and smoke rising from the chimney. Sarah stumbled up the steps to the front porch and pounded on the door, no longer caring about anything except finding help. "Please," she called out. "I need help. Someone's after me." She could hear movement inside the cabin, and after what seemed like an eternity, the door opened. Standing in the doorway was a man in his 50s, tall and lean with weathered features and kind eyes. He took one look at Sarah's torn clothes and panicked expression and immediately stepped aside. "Come in," he said without hesitation. "What happened to you?" Sarah stumbled into the warmth of the cabin, finally feeling safe for the first time in hours. But even as relief washed over her, she couldn't shake the feeling that her troubles were just beginning. Whoever had been pursuing her knew her name and had resources she didn't understand. Getting away from them tonight was just the first step in what promised to be a much larger and more dangerous game. The man who answered the door introduced himself as Tom Brennan, and something about his calm demeanor immediately put Sarah at ease. He didn't pepper her with questions or demand explanations. Instead, he guided her to a comfortable chair near the fireplace and handed her a warm blanket without saying a word. The cabin was exactly what Sarah would have imagined from the outside. Rustic, but comfortable, with exposed wooden beams and furniture that looked handmade but expensive. "I'll make some coffee," Tom said quietly. "Take as much time as you need." He moved to the kitchen, which was separated from the living room by only a breakfast bar, giving Sarah space to collect herself while still keeping her in sight. She watched as he moved around the kitchen with practiced efficiency, measuring coffee grounds and setting a kettle on what appeared to be a professional-grade stove. Everything about the cabin suggested that its owner had money, but chose to live simply. Sarah pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders and tried to process what had just happened. In the warmth and safety of the cabin, The events in the woods seemed almost surreal. Had she really been chased by men with flashlights who knew her name? Had she really found blood and an abandoned phone by a mysterious fire? Her rational mind tried to convince her that fear and darkness had made her imagination run wild. But the scratches on her arms and the tears in her clothes were very real. "Here," Tom said, returning with a steaming mug of coffee. The smell was rich and complex, nothing like the instant coffee Sarah was used to. She wrapped her hands around the warm ceramic and took a tentative sip. It was perfect, strong enough to steady her nerves, but not so bitter that she couldn't drink it. "Better," Sarah nodded, finally trusting herself to speak. "Thank you. I'm sorry to barge in like this, but I didn't know where else to go." She looked up at Tom, trying to read his expression. He seemed genuinely concerned, but there was something else in his eyes. Recognition, maybe? As if he had been expecting her. "Don't apologize," Tom said, settling into the chair across from her. "You said someone was after you. Do you want to tell me what happened?" His voice was gentle but serious, like someone accustomed to dealing with emergencies. Sarah wondered what he did for a living that would give him that kind of calm competence. Sarah told him everything, starting with the eviction notice and ending with her desperate flight through the woods. Tom listened without interruption, his expression growing more serious with each detail. When she mentioned the blood on the phone and the men who knew her name, he leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped in front of him. "Sarah Martinez," Tom said when she finished. It wasn't a question. Somehow he already knew who she was. Sarah's heart began to race again, and she started to stand up, but Tom held up a hand. "It's okay. I'm not going to hurt you. But I think you've stumbled into something much bigger than you realize." "How do you know my name?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She was calculating the distance to the door, wondering if she could make it outside before Tom could stop her. But where would she go? Her car was still back at the trailhead, assuming it was even safe to return there. Tom was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. When he spoke, his voice was careful, measured. "I've been looking for you, Sarah. Not to hurt you, but to help you. You're in danger, and it's connected to something that happened a long time ago. Something involving your parents." Sarah felt like the floor had dropped out from under her. "My parents? They died when I was 3 years old. Car accident. There's nothing mysterious about it." But even as she said the words, she realized how little she actually knew about her parents' death. The foster system had given her the basic facts, but she had never seen police reports or investigated the details. She had been too young to remember them, and too focused on survival to dig into the past. "That's what you were told," Tom said gently. "And maybe the people who told you that believed it was true. But your parents didn't die in a car accident, Sarah. They were killed because they uncovered something that powerful people wanted to keep hidden. And now, 20 years later, that same information is surfacing again." Sarah set down her coffee cup with shaking hands. "That's impossible. You're talking about conspiracy theories and cover-ups. That's not real life. That's movie stuff." But even as she protested, pieces of a puzzle she hadn't known existed began to fall into place. The way some of her foster parents had acted nervous when she asked about her past. The sealed records that she had never been able to access. The feeling that people were keeping secrets from her. Tom stood up and walked to a desk in the corner of the room. He returned with a manila folder that looked thick with documents. "Your father was an investigative journalist," he said, handing her the folder. "Your mother was a forensic accountant. They were working together on a story about illegal mining operations on protected federal land. They had documentation proving that high-level government officials were taking bribes to allow environmental destruction in areas that were supposed to be preserved." Sarah opened the folder with trembling fingers. The first thing she saw was a newspaper clipping with a photo that made her breath catch in her throat. A man and woman standing together, smiling at the camera. The man had Sarah's dark hair and eyes. The woman had her smile. She was looking at her parents for the first time in her adult life. "They look like me," she whispered, tracing her finger over the photograph. "You look exactly like your mother did at your age," Tom said. "That's part of why you're in danger now. The mining operation your parents exposed was shut down, but the people behind it were never prosecuted. They went underground, literally and figuratively. They've been operating for 20 years, thinking they were safe. But recently, some of the original evidence has surfaced. Sarah looked up from the photograph. What does this have to do with me? I don't know anything about mining or corruption or any of this. But her mind was racing, connecting dots she had never seen before. Her parents hadn't died in a random accident. They had been murdered. And somehow, that put her in danger too. Your father hid copies of the evidence before he died, Tom explained. He knew he was being watched, knew that he and your mother were in danger. He gave the information to someone he trusted, with instructions that it should be released if anything happened to them. That person has been protecting the evidence for 20 years, but now they're dying, and they want to fulfill their promise to your father. Who? Sarah asked. Who has been protecting this evidence for 20 years? Tom was quiet for a moment, and Sarah could see him struggling with something. Finally, he said, Me. I've been protecting it, and now I need to give it to you. The room seemed to spin around Sarah. This stranger, this man who had appeared out of nowhere to rescue her, had been connected to her parents all along. You knew them, she said. It wasn't a question. Your father was my best friend, Tom said quietly. We served together in the military before he became a journalist. When he realized how dangerous his investigation had become, he asked me to be his insurance policy. If something happened to him and your mother, I was supposed to make sure their work wasn't buried with them. Sarah felt overwhelmed by information and emotions she wasn't prepared to handle. 24 hours ago, her biggest problem had been paying rent. Now she was learning that her parents had been murdered and that she was somehow connected to a decades-old conspiracy. Why now, she asked. Why are you telling me this now? Because the people who killed your parents know that the evidence still exists, Tom said. They've been looking for it, and for you, for a long time. Recently, they've gotten closer to finding both. Tonight wasn't a random attack, Sarah. They followed you to that trail. They were planning to take you somewhere quiet where they could question you about what you know. But I don't know anything. Sarah protested. I was 3 years old when they died. I don't remember them at all. They don't know that, Tom said. As far as they're concerned, you're the daughter of 2 people who caused them a lot of trouble. They think your parents might have told you something or left you something that could implicate them. And even if they eventually figure out that you don't have any information, you're still a liability. You're living proof that Robert and Maria Martinez existed, that they had a child, that their story deserves to be told. Sarah looked down at the folder in her hands. Inside were dozens of documents, photographs, financial records, and what appeared to be recorded conversations. Her parents' life's work, preserved by a man she had met only an hour ago. What am I supposed to do with this? That's your choice, Tom said. I've been waiting 20 years for you to become old enough to make that decision. You can take the evidence and finish your parents' work. Expose the corruption, get justice for their deaths, maybe prevent other environmental disasters. Or you can walk away, change your name, move somewhere far from Montana, and try to build a normal life. Sarah knew what he wasn't saying. Either choice was dangerous. If she pursued her parents' investigation, the people who killed them would try to kill her too. But if she tried to disappear, they might hunt her down anyway, just to be safe. There was no truly safe option, only different kinds of risk. If I decide to pursue this, Sarah said slowly, I can't do it alone. I don't know anything about journalism or investigations or how to stay safe from people who kill anyone who gets in their way. Tom smiled for the first time since she had arrived. I was hoping you would say that. I've been preparing for this day for 20 years, Sarah. I have resources, connections, and a very strong motivation to see that your parents' killers finally face justice. If you're willing to see this through, I'll be with you every step of the way. Sarah stood up and walked to the window. Outside, the forest was dark and quiet, giving no hint of the drama that had played out there just hours earlier. She thought about the life she had been living, struggling to pay bills, working multiple jobs, fighting just to survive from one day to the next. It wasn't much of a life, but it was hers. If she agreed to Tom's proposal, she would be giving up any chance of the normal future she had been working toward. But then, she thought about her parents, 2 people she had never known but who had died trying to protect something important. They had been murdered for doing what they thought was right, and their killers had never been punished. For 20 years, those killers had been free to continue their crimes, confident that they had gotten away with murder. Sarah realized that she was the only person in the world who could change that. "Tell me about your resources," she said, turning back to Tom. "If I'm going to do this, I need to know exactly what I'm getting into." Tom's smile widened. "That's a very good question, and the answer might surprise you." He walked to another desk and returned with a laptop. "My full name is Thomas Brennan. You might recognize the name if you follow business news." Sarah shook her head. She had been too busy surviving to pay attention to business news. "Brennan Industries," Tom said. "Mining, construction, real estate development. We're one of the largest privately held companies in the Northwest. I'm worth about $800 million. Sarah stared at him. "You're a millionaire." "Several times over," Tom confirmed. "I built my company from nothing, starting about 15 years ago. Every dollar I made, every business deal I closed, every investment I made was motivated by one thing: getting enough money and power to take down the people who killed your parents." The implications of what Tom was telling her slowly sank in. She wasn't just being offered help by a friend of her parents. She was being offered help by one of the wealthiest and most powerful men in Montana. A man who had spent 15 years building an empire for the specific purpose of getting justice for her parents. "Why?" Sarah asked. "Why would you spend your entire adult life on this? Why not just go to the police with the evidence?" Tom's expression darkened. "Because some of the people involved in your parents' murder are in law enforcement. Others are in government. The corruption goes deeper than you can imagine, Sarah. Going through official channels would just get the evidence buried and probably get us killed. The only way to expose this is to do it publicly, dramatically, in a way that's too big for them to cover up." Sarah sat back down, feeling overwhelmed again. "So what's the plan? How do we take down a conspiracy that's been operating for 20 years? Carefully, Tom said, "and with a lot of backup plans. But first, we need to get you somewhere safe. This cabin is secure, but it's not a long-term solution. I have a ranch about 50 miles north of here. It's completely off the grid, with its own power source and security system. We can use it as our base of operations while we plan our next moves." "What about my life?" Sarah asked. "My apartment, my school, my jobs? I'm supposed to graduate in 3 months. All of that will have to wait," Tom said gently. "Sarah, the people who killed your parents sent a team after you tonight. They know where you live, where you work, where you go to school. If you go back to your normal routine, you'll be dead within a week. The only way you're going to survive this is by disappearing completely until we're ready to make our move." Sarah felt a grief she hadn't expected for the life she was about to lose. It hadn't been a great life, but it had been hers. She had worked so hard to build something stable, something that belonged to her. Now she was being asked to give it all up for a cause she had just learned about an hour ago. But then, she looked at the photograph of her parents again. They had been younger than she was now when they died. They had given up everything, including their lives, to fight for something they believed in. Could she do any less? "Okay," Sarah said finally. "I'll do it. But I want to know everything. Every detail about what happened to my parents, every plan you have for exposing the truth, every risk we'll be taking. If I'm going to put my life on the line for this, I want to know exactly what I'm fighting for." Tom nodded approvingly. "I wouldn't expect anything less from Robert Martinez's daughter. We'll leave for the ranch first thing in the morning. Tonight, you should try to get some rest. Tomorrow, we start planning how to bring down one of the most powerful criminal conspiracies in the country." As if on cue, Sarah's body reminded her that she had been running on adrenaline for hours. Exhaustion hit her like a physical blow, and she could barely keep her eyes open. Tom showed her to a small bedroom at the back of the cabin, complete with fresh linens and a view of the forest that had nearly been her doom just hours earlier. Sarah lay in the unfamiliar bed, staring up at the ceiling and trying to process everything that had happened. This morning, she had been Sarah Martinez, struggling college student. Tonight, she was Sarah Martinez, daughter of murdered journalists and partner to a millionaire vigilante. The transformation was so complete and so sudden that it felt like she was living someone else's life. But as she drifted off to sleep, holding the folder of her parents' work against her chest, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in years: purpose. For the first time in her adult life, she was part of something bigger than her own survival. She was connected to people who had loved her, even if she couldn't remember them. She had someone to fight for and someone to fight with. The last thing Sarah remembered before falling asleep was the sound of Tom moving around the cabin, checking locks and closing blinds. Even in sleep, he was protecting her, just as he had been protecting her parents' legacy for 20 years. Whatever dangers tomorrow might bring, she wouldn't face them alone. Outside the cabin, the forest was quiet and peaceful, giving no hint of the storm that was about to break over the conspiracy that had been operating in shadows for 2 decades. The hunters had found their prey, but they had also awakened something they never expected: the combined fury of a daughter seeking justice and a friend who had never stopped fighting for the truth. In her,